Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us here this evening for IOP Fellow Laura Washington's third seminar as part of the newly formed ChiElect program, covering the issues, concerns, and candidates sure to play a major role in Chicago's next mayoral election on February 26th. Laura brings extensive knowledge of Chicago politics and journalism to the IOP. She has more than 2 decades of experience as a print and broadcast journalist, as well as a nonprofit professional. She has served as an editor for the Chicago Reporter, a nationally recognized publication covering race and poverty. As well, she has also served as deputy press secretary to Harold Washington, Chicago's first African-American mayor. Laura is currently a columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times, specializing in media-related issues, African-American affairs, local and national politics, as well as social justice. She also serves as a political analyst for ABC 7 Chicago. We are also delighted to have mayoral candidate Lori Lightfoot here this evening to discuss her vision for the city of Chicago and why she is running for mayor. Ms. Lightfoot is a former assistant United States attorney here in Illinois, as well as the former president of the Chicago Police Board and chair of the Chicago Police Accountability Task Force. Save for a year-long clerkship on the Michigan Supreme Court in Detroit, Ms. Lightfoot has lived in Chicago since 1986. Today's seminar is on the record, which means you are free to take photo and video. And as well, students will have the opportunity to ask questions during or after the seminar. Again, thank you all for coming this evening. I'll hand it over to Ms. Washington and Ms. Lightfoot.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. What a fabulous turnout. Thanks for being here on this slippery night. I wanted to thank you, Lori, for coming here. This is kind of a homecoming for you.
It is. It's always good to be back in Hyde Park.
And tell us what your connection to Hyde Park is.
Well, I started my life in Chicago in 1986 here in Hyde Park. I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to attend the University of Chicago Law School, and this has been a big part of my Chicago identity ever since.
Could you elaborate a little bit on what is Hyde Park? How has it impacted your Chicago identity?
Well, it's an interesting place, right? I mean, for the long time, Hyde Park was one of the few places where interracial couples could live and live comfortably. Not that it's not segregated in the ways that other neighborhoods are, but it feels like a different and special place because it's been much more welcoming, particularly along the racial divide, than other neighborhoods in Chicago. It's also interesting because it's obviously situated on the south side, and while Hyde Park, and certainly in the 32 years since I came here, has flourished in a lot of ways, the surrounding area has languished in a lot of big ways, and particularly Washington Park. If you compare the demographics between Hyde Park and Washington Park, they're almost like they're situated in 2 different regions rather than literally right next to each other. And frankly, the growth and transformation of what I'll call the commercial corridors in Hyde Park make it in some ways unrecognizable from what I remember back in the day. But people here in this community have a real sense of pride in being Hyde Parkers. Again, I can't describe it in any other way. They just love being from here. There's a generational longevity of being in Hyde Park, and it feels very different than other neighborhoods that I've come to know in the city.
Mm-hmm. And it feels very different from, in many ways, other South Side neighborhoods.
Oh, very different from other South Side. I mean, obviously, having the university situated here,
sure.
The university takes up a lot of literally physical and other airspace, so that definitely makes a difference. But yes, it's very different than its other South Side neighbors.
And there are pros and cons to what the university's role is.
Yeah, I mean, it's had a controversial history, which is probably putting it mildly. When I came here in 1986 at the law school, which is on the other side of the Midway, which back then meant you were like in an isolated desert. The southern border of the law school on 61st Street had a barbed wire fence, which sent a real message. And frankly, at that time, if you were a black student on campus, which was pretty much a rarity, and particularly in the graduate programs, there were a lot of black men that were in the law school who were routinely stopped by university police, basically saying, show me your papers. What are you doing here? So it's had a complicated relationship with the surrounding neighborhoods, and it definitely has a complicated history when it comes to talking about issues of race.
Going back to your personal history, could you tell us, is there a personal story or something in your background that would explain why you decided to go into government and public service?
Well, I guess I will say in part because of my mother's experience. My mother was on a school board, an elected school board for years and years and years in the little town that I grew up in. I worked in Washington on Capitol Hill, so that kind of gave me my first real taste of public service. And I just understand, particularly at the municipal level, you really have the capacity to make significant changes and impact people's lives in pretty profound ways. Plus, to me, there's no greater kind of professional accomplishment than doing something you know is going to have immediate impact on a person's life and making things better. And you know, I got asked this question earlier today. All right, with all the complications and the messes in City Hall, you know, how do you really think you're going to be able to make a difference? Well, in every position that I've held, whether when I worked for the Chicago Police Department, or when I worked at the city's 911 center, or when I went in to try to fix the city's broken procurement system, there were these obstacles that seemed like a given, like they were intractable. But in every instance, I was able to make a difference by just saying, okay, well, this doesn't make sense. We have to do it a different way. And that taught me a valuable lesson that leadership and determination can really break through a lot of seemingly intractable problems.
Well, we certainly have plenty of them in Chicago
Yeah,
right
we do.
now. Well, so given that, what is, I mean, I know this could be an hour's conversation just in of itself, but share with us what your vision is for the city and how that's different from the 14 or so other candidates that are out there. Why you and what is there about your vision? That
Well,
makes-
the biggest difference is stemming from who I am. I am an outsider in the sense that I'm not beholden to political party, not beholden to any unions. I'm my own person. I'm independent. And as I said, I have a track record of taking on big, tough problems, none more difficult than working on reform and accountability in the Chicago Police Department. That is the kind of determination that I will bring to the mayor's office. I'm not afraid of taking on things that are unpopular or seemingly difficult if it's the right thing to do. And one of the biggest differences, I think, between me and, I'll say, the pack of frontrunners is I've been talking about good government and accountability from day one of this campaign. I was the first person to release a good government policy back in August. And you know, a couple of things that we talked about now are in vogue. I talked about the fact that no city official, whether elected or appointed, should be able to monetize their position. Of course, I was thinking about Ed Burke at that time. I also talked about
Why didn't you say so at the time?
I think I did say so at the
Did you?
time.
You actually called him out?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been around and watching Burke maneuver for quite a long time. You know, if you look at, and the other thing that is part of our good government policy is, you know, taking back the workers' compensation program. I mean, just as a matter of common sense, $100 million a year program, which query why it's $100 million, that makes no sense, in the hands of a single person who's not part of the executive branch and who refuses to have any transparency around it. Makes no sense whatsoever. And I called that out and said it needs to be taken away from him. It needs to go back into the executive branch. It's a basic HR function, and we had to treat it as such. No one talked about that then, and frankly, very few members of the press picked up on that. And then suddenly, Ed Burke's offices get raided, Ed Burke gets charged, and everybody's racing to look like they're the reform and good government candidate, but here I stand alone as the true reformer in this race.
What else would you say is in your bailiwick, in your pot of policy issues regarding government accountability? There's been some conversation about term limits, outside jobs, a number of other things. It's a lot of the candidates are talking about since after
all in our
Burke's
good government
demise.
policy from August. Yeah, I believe in mayoral term limits. I think we got to look at two terms. Yeah, that's enough. I mean, it's a hard job. If you can't get done what you want to get done in 2 terms, then shame on you. If we look at the history of our city, we haven't had term limits, and we've had people who've stayed in office way too long. And particularly, I know this from kind of the later years of the Daley administration. They run out of ideas, run out of innovation. You run out of the good people who had a personal relationship with the candidate who can say, hey, that's a bad idea, or you need to do X. Instead, what you get is people who are grateful for the opportunity to be in public service, but don't have the gravitas to be able to steer the candidate in the right direction. And that's terrible for public policy, and frankly terrible for delivering the promises of good government to citizens. So term limits, I'm absolutely in favor of.
And for the alderman as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an argument to be made that it should be more than 2 terms for aldermen. You don't want to turn basically city government into the playground of lobbyists. But yeah, aldermen should absolutely have term limits, no question about it. And particularly term limits on how long you can be the chairman of a particular committee. There's lots of different reforms that need to happen at the aldermanic level, and I think this election is going to bring probably a third of the city council, is my prediction, will be turned over, which I think is, again, a good and healthy thing for our democracy, with a lot of young candidates who have great innovative ideas and are just going to bring a whole new sense of energy. You know this. Dick Simpson in UIC releases a report every year that looks at how many times, what the voting record is of aldermen vis-a-vis the mayor. And most of the aldermen are way north of 90% agreement with the mayor. That makes no sense. And they haven't built the infrastructure to actually really perform meaningful oversight and to be an independent body, and that's a problem too. One of the first things I will do is tell them, you got to get your own lawyer. Now, why is that important? Right now, the Corporation Counsel, that's the head of the city's law department, serves both the mayor personally, which is a problem, the city government, and is a lawyer for city council. So who is his client? As a lawyer, you have a client, and you try to shy away from unwaivable conflicts. It is a flat-out conflict for the head of city council, the head of the law department, to have all these different clients whose interests obviously diverge because they're sitting in different seats, they represent different constituencies. It makes no sense.
And that reared its ugly head in the whole Quan McDonald
Indeed it did.
Disaster, and
Yeah.
especially in terms of the way that the video was handled and released.
Yep.
Can I go back to last week, because
Sure.
that was a really monumental
Yeah.
time in Chicago history, particularly around some of the issues that you've worked so hard on, and the acquittal of the 3 police officers in
Right.
the cover-up trial, and of course the sentencing of Jason Van Dyke to just less than 7 years. What was your reaction to those events, and what does that mean for us going forward?
Well, I think acquittal in the cover-up case, I was disappointed but not terribly surprised. If you look at the track record of police officers being charged with crimes for on-duty conduct, very few actually ever get convicted, very few. 26th Street, most of the judges there
Criminal
are criminal courthouse. Most of the judges there are former state prosecutors. They are loath to find misconduct on the part of officers. Look, this is a county that has sent more people to the death row who are innocent, and there's very little accountability for that. I was particularly concerned when I learned that the judge failed to disclose that she had a prior professional relationship with one of the defense attorneys.
That was commonly known, I think, on the street.
Right,
Yeah, but she didn't.
She
wasn't
disclose
public about it. Yeah.
Why does that matter? When you start a criminal case, and really other cases, if you have what's called a substitution of judge, SOJ, as of right, and you can do that for any reason without articulating a reason. If the prosecutors had known that she had that prior professional relationship with one of the defense attorneys, they may have opted to get a different judge. But by hiding that information, not disclosing it, she robbed the prosecution of being able to do that, because once a judge is invested and you've seen how they rule, then the only way you get rid of that judge is for cause, which is really a very high burden. The fact that she didn't disclose that, to me, was really problematic, and frankly, was a red flag about what direction she may be heading.
And that's Domenica Stevenson.
Right,
And,
right.
And the attorney in that case that she had the relationship with
Jim
was?
McKay.
And what was it? They worked together closely?
They were state's attorneys together. Right.
So you saw that one coming in some extent,
Well, I mean, again, you look at,
given the circumstances.
yeah, you look at the history, you look at the fact that they took a bench, you look at now this relationship that she had, which she didn't disclose. I wasn't terribly surprised. Look, I think that the prosecutors did a very a public service in bringing this case forward, because while obviously the conviction of Jason Van Dyke was important because it was clearly a murder, in some ways putting the system on trial that went into play immediately after that shooting happened was important for us to see and take a measurement of where we are on real reform and legitimacy. We got a message that we still have many, many miles to travel on this path last week. Jason Van Dyke getting, frankly, less time than a lot of people spend in pretrial detention, meaning being locked up at Cook County Jail waiting for their trial, is an outrage. I mean, there's no other way to look at it. You know, and Patty Blagojevich made this point, which I thought was very poignant. He will be in and out of jail before her husband, who took no money, will be in federal prison.
He received a 14-year sentence.
He received a 14-year sentence on a no money crime, and yet Jason Van Dyke will be in and out of jail in probably 3 years or maybe less when you add in the time served for committing a murder. I mean, that's just staggering.
And how does that happen, and what can be done about it? There were a lot of calls for action and you know, changing the law, removing the judge, going to the ballot box. Why did that happen, and what could be done about it?
Well, part of it happened. Look, we just have to put race on the table, right? There's no possibility that if a black man in the same circumstance killed a young white teenager in the same kind of circumstances, that he would have gotten, in effect, a slap on the wrist. No chance that would have happened. What do you do about it? I think it's way past time for us to shine a spotlight on what happens at 26th Street. You know, I've spent time practicing down there, and it's heartbreaking every single time you walk in. There's nothing that looks like justice down there. Almost every single defendant that comes before the bench is black. Some Latinos, rarely do you see a white suspect, white defendant. Rarely does that happen. They're wearing these beige prison jumpsuits. They stand before the court for a matter of seconds. They barely get any time with their lawyers. You know, maybe there's a family member that's in the audience that they'll take a quick glance at and wave. I mean, there's nothing that feels like justice that happens in the criminal courts in this county. And up until recently, when they went for bail decisions, they didn't even get to see the judge. They stood in a row on videotape. I've had clients that have had that experience. So we have to keep working on issues of criminal justice reform, but we have to shine a spotlight on these judges. Because frankly, while I absolutely agree with the necessity and the imperative of having an independent judiciary, they are not delivering justice to black and brown communities by any stretch.
And is that because they're handcuffed by the system and the way it's structured, or that's because they're racist?
Well, I don't know that those are the two options. I think that they become indifferent to what's going on in communities. And people get on a conveyor belt at 26th Street, and they just move on and on and on, and rarely does anyone ask. And that includes, frankly, public defenders, certainly state's attorneys, and the judges. Is this justice? Does this person really deserve to be here? I mean, frequently, sadly, the only time that question gets asked is after there's a conviction and maybe the case goes up on appeal. Many times it doesn't happen until after the direct appeals are exhausted and a person files what's called a post-conviction petition, which is very hard to get relief on. But we don't have justice in our criminal justice system in Cook County for a host of reasons, race clearly being one of them. But until we start challenging what's happening in the criminal courts on all levels and holding judges accountable for the sometimes egregious way in which they mete out justice, that part's never going to change.
What can you do as mayor about this? I mean, you're not running the 26th California. You're not running the county jail. You're not running a number of the agencies that have direct control of the judiciary.
Yeah.
So, what is a mayor? What is your plan as mayor to address these inequities?
Well, number one, you got to focus on the prison pipeline, right? A lot of young people, and they're mostly men, are getting in this system because of petty crimes of poverty. So as mayor, you've got to stand up and make sure that you're doing everything that you can to bring real economic hope to these communities that are devastated by the lack of investment, high unemployment, high levels of poverty. That's something that I think has to be a central charge of the next mayor. And I've laid out a number of different things that I want to do to address that problem, that has to be a major priority for the next administration. Although you don't have control over the judiciary and the courts, I think it's critically important that you build a relationship with people who are in charge of these different parts of the system. And frankly, try to build partnerships where you can. But for example, for way too long, the Chief Judge Evans and now presiding judge Leroy Martin, the second or the third, whatever it is, who's in charge of the criminal courts, the judges there that set bail were just absolutely shooting from the hip every single time. They were not using the required tools of evaluating whether the person was a flight risk or whether or not they were a danger to the community. They're just setting bail. And what you saw, again, these people who were locked up for crimes of poverty, if you set a bail for $1,000 and they have no money in their pocket, they don't have anybody in their network, whether family or otherwise, who can help them, they're sitting in Cook County for years when what they needed was $100 to get themselves out. I mean, that's absolutely absurd, particularly if you don't have a moral imperative to do something about that. From a financial standpoint, taxpayers' dollars are being wasted incarcerating people who are not a threat to the community and are not a flight risk. So why are they locked up? So that's something that a mayor absolutely can speak out on. And I've been talking about this for several years now, that we have to get rid of the cash bail system. It makes no sense.
You mentioned you have an economic plan. Could you talk a little bit more about that? What
Sure.
does that entail? And the other side of that is education in the schools.
Absolutely.
And one of the implied.
Well, to me, it's an intrinsic part of it.
Exactly, and those two areas are not necessarily where most of your experience lies. Most of your experience is in the criminal justice system, the policing system. So talk to us about what your plan is and what you bring to that.
Well, knowing that, if you look at the areas that are crime plagued, there's like a one-to-one match with those that are economically distressed. So to me, and I've been very clear about this, what we're seeing in terms of the violence is really a public health crisis, which means we have to look at the root causes of the violence to make any real meaningful difference in the violence. That means we have to have an neighborhood investment plan, not unlike a Marshall Plan for these neighborhoods that can really meaningfully drive down the crime rate. That means we have to look at things like the fact that there is 25% or higher unemployment. What that means in reality is there are neighborhoods where kids grow up not knowing anybody who goes to a job every day. So we can't just plop down jobs in these communities. We have to think about what is the pipeline that we need to build to get people to good jobs. But the overlay is we got to deal with the violence. No one's coming in investing in businesses. They're not going to, excuse me, look to build wealth in neighborhoods through jobs if they feel like they're not going to be safe. So we got to deal with the violence, and I've laid out a very comprehensive plan for dealing with that. We have to build small business capacity in these neighborhoods. Again, on the south side, the west side, we get these commercial corridors where there's nothing there except maybe a liquor store or some little quickie market, which are invariably owned by people who don't live in those neighborhoods and who don't hire from the neighborhoods, which means we're not building any wealth in those neighborhoods. So we've got to unlock the potential for small business development and focus like that in a way that hasn't been a focus, certainly not in the last 7 years, but for a very long time. That means that we've got to, excuse me, both, let me take a drink. thought it was a good idea to take our daughter to a water park, and literally the next day, I started with this cold, since it's like whirling around in a petri dish. But when I worked with small businesses, both when I was at the procurement department and in my private practice life, the one thing that you hear over and over again is access to capital. So there's a couple of things I think that the city can do right away. In thinking about the $2 billion plus procurement that it does every year for goods and services, we've got to break down the contracts in small enough chunks that small businesses, particularly minority, women-owned, and other disadvantaged enterprises, can get those contracts and work them without the help or the need to have a general contractor or somebody else. So they need to be their own bosses on those contracts, and we can do that. Number two, the city has to look at who it's partnering with in businesses. We spend a lot of money, for example, in IT, partnering with companies that don't reside in Chicago and don't hire from Chicago. That, of course, doesn't make any sense. We also have to think about making sure that in those contracts, we're speaking our values. And by that, I mean, we have to tell companies that want to do business with the city, you got to hire from the city. We care about building wealth and capacity in minority, women-owned, LGBTQ, veterans, small businesses. What are your policies and procedures for what we'll call supplier diversity? We're not asking those questions now.
And these are things that you would build into the bidding process?
Absolutely right. We got to do that.
And that would be legal? I mean,
Yeah, it's happening all over the country, but we're not doing it here.
Mm-hmm.
Number three, as I said before, the city has to be a catalyst for getting small grants into the hands of entrepreneurs to make sure that they have access to capital from the city, but also, frankly, we need to beat on the banks and other lenders to give micro lending to these small businesses. One of the things the city does, for example, is has this neighborhood opportunity grant. And what it says is, if you're a business, you got a good idea, you apply for these grants, and lo and behold, you get a grant. The problem is they're matching grants. So if you're a small business and you don't have a line of credit, you're not going to have the money to put up another $100,000 to get the money that the city is giving. We need to break that program down, make it a true grant, not a matching grant, or a loan even, but we got to get the resources to the small businesses. Those are some of the ideas that I think we need to do. On the jobs front, we have to recognize that where there's no history of work, we can't just plop down businesses and say, okay, have at it. There are programs right now that are underway. Heartland Alliance in particular has a really good program where I think they've got 200 to 300, mostly men, that they're providing cognitive behavioral therapy, other wraparound services, and then linking them up with real jobs that they can get on the back end. If you've never gone to work, you don't know about being on time, submitting to the will of a supervisor, some of the basic things that we take for granted, those don't resonate with people who've never worked in a job before. So we just have to deal with that reality and put those services in place. One other thing that I neglected on small businesses, the city, I think, has to put together incubators in neighborhoods outside of the loop that are incubation hubs for small businesses, for entrepreneurs, help them write business plans, marketing plan, hook them up with peers, and frankly, mentors. Those are things that I think will spur a lot of economic activity in the neighborhoods.
And that's something that would be coordinated by City Hall?
Yes,
and
it has to be.
And where would the resources, where would the money come from to,
well,
these sound like very expensive
yes
activities.
and no. I mean, the Neighborhood Opportunity Grant funds are already there. Mm-hmm. We're just talking about using them.
Those are federal funds?
Yeah, prioritizing them. We've got all these TIF funds that, frankly, in a lot of the TIFs, there are surpluses. If a neighborhood is truly blighted, we need to be using those TIF funds to build capacity. And we're not doing that, I think, in an effective way. So there's money out there to fund these different ideas. It's just a question of priorities.
Speaking of money and revenue, I don't know if you heard about Toni Preckwinkle's proposal that she put out today about related to ticketing. Have you heard about this?
Yeah, I saw it.
Well, I guess that answered my question. Of course, I haven't asked yet. But for those of you who haven't heard, it's a plan to cut back to change the city's ticketing policy which she believes is onerous and punitive, particularly for people of color and lower income people. Cut fees on city stickers, people who get their licenses suspended because they have too many moving violations. She wants to change that. There's a law that says that if you're a scofflaw, if you have a lot of tickets, if you haven't paid, that you can't get city employment. So you don't like it?
No, it's not that I don't like it. It's just where's she been? These are things that many people in the campaign, me included, have been talking about for months. And again, I believe actions speak louder than words. If she thinks these are really good ideas, she should repeal the number of regressive taxes that she's imposed at the county level. She said she fought and won against Todd Strolger by saying she was going to repeal the sales tax. There's no more regressive tax than a sales tax. And yet, then 2 years later, after she got in office, she reimposed it. She fought for, and luckily lost, the soda tax. So I want her to make a pledge that as mayor, she's not going to impose, again, an incredibly regressive tax on sodas. She has taxed people and nickel and dime them to death at the county level on a number of different levels. If she really, truly believes in these things, make it happen now at the county level. Give county taxpayers some immediate relief. So I'm skeptical of these people who have election year conversions when she, of all people, as a countywide official who's got a county budget, who's got taxing authority, could do things right now today to provide relief. It's not that I disagree with the things that she's recommended today. It doesn't make sense that we're throwing people into bankruptcy over tickets. It doesn't make sense that people are losing their cars over non-moving violations. Of course, none of that makes sense. I called back in, I think, September or October for doing a total audit of the red light camera, doing away with these kind of regressive, redundant tickets. So if you sit right now in Chicago, if you get a ticket in the morning and you happen to not move your car for multiple hours, you can get multiple tickets during that time period. Of course, that makes no sense. If you get a ticket, you bought that spot for the day. We shouldn't be throwing people into bankruptcy over tickets of any sort. There are things that we absolutely should change. I'm glad that she's agreeing with the rest of us who have been talking about this for months. But again, put your money where your mouth is, Tony, and make those changes at the county level.
What is your position? You're saying you'd like to see her make a pledge that she wouldn't bring back the soda tax, for example, and bring back some of these other regressive taxes. What is your commitment on taxes, property taxes, fees,
well,
that
look,
kind of thing? What is your general
I think
commitment on
that the reality is, given the state of municipal finance, we're going to have a conversation about revenue. There's no question about it. But the guidelines that I've set for myself and for our team is that they have to be progressive sources of revenue. We are losing low and middle income individuals and families because they're getting crushed by the tax burden. Now they're leaving also, I think, because of the violence, but the tax burden, that's what I hear everywhere. And not just in that sector. I think people all over are feeling crushed. And look, I think in a democratic city like Chicago, no one likes to pay taxes, but they recognize government can't function. We can't do the basic things about educating our children, providing public safety, and other basic things that the government needs to do without tax revenue. But the problem is they've lost confidence that city government is going to function as responsible fiscal agents. We've been treating taxpayers like an unlimited ATM machine, and that's got to stop. So yes, unfortunately, we are going to have a very serious conversation about revenue soon after the new mayor takes office. But I think you have to build the case for revenue. By that I mean, we've got runaway expenses. Since this is University of Chicago, I'll put my geek hat on and talk about one thing that I think is important, and hopefully you'll understand. The city government budget itself is about $10 billion. We have no risk management system in the city budget, which means that we have nobody whose full-time job it is to look at mitigating waste, fraud, and abuse, and having the power to actually do something about it. So if we had a risk management system, I'd like to think, for example, we wouldn't continue to spend $50 to $60 million every single year on police settlements, judgments, and attorney's fees, which we go into the bond market and borrow. We wouldn't keep blowing through the overtime budget in the police department to the tune of $100 million every year or more. We wouldn't have litigation costs writ large that are out of control. For example, in this past year's budget, they allocated $40 million for the whole year for all city litigation. The truth is we blew through that budget on June 30th. So for the last 6 months of the year, we were operating in uncharted territory, unbudgeted funds. So things like that actually add up. And if we had a real risk management system, we'd be able to combat that. On the pension front, again, no easy answer. There just isn't. But we have 4 different pension funds. Every single one of those pension funds has its own separate investment advisor, has its own separate administrative function that's tens of millions of dollars every year that we shouldn't be paying, and we can shrink the size of those administrative and investment costs if we had a single system that advised the different pension funds. Why do we need a separate clerk's office? We don't.
This is politics.
It's all politics.
This
right.
is taking care of people so they take care of you.
Yeah. We don't need it. And not particularly not in a time where we're going to have to ask taxpayers to dig into their pockets and give more. We don't need a separate treasurer's office. That too is politics, right? We can get rid of those 2 separate offices with all the administrative overhead and the salaries, bring them into city government. I don't believe we put people on the street, but over time, we can recycle those people into other functions of government if necessary, but get rid of the overhead of those 2 offices that are largely providing redundant or unnecessary functions. So those are some of the things I think we have to do to build the case for revenue.
Okay, I want to go to one more thing and then open it up to all of you. And back a little bit to your personal life and the fact that you are you're making history by being the first openly LGBTQ person to run for mayor. Why is that important, and what does it say about our city that you're in this position?
Well, the fact that I am able to run openly as a married person with a child really, I think, says something pretty remarkable about where we are in the history of our city. Look, we've got many other challenges. We're not as welcoming and inclusive as we need to be. But the fact that I can do this without worrying about repercussions or consequences or, frankly, death threats says that we have made remarkable progress in this city. So I'm very, very proud of that. I hope what it means is that for young people that are out there trying to find their way, and frankly, I was here in Hyde Park when I was really going through my own coming out process. I hope it says to them, hang in there, that you have the ability to live your own authentic self and your own authentic life. And I hope it also says a message to parents who worry about their kids who are coming out to them, that they can live a life of value, of merit. So that's what I hope my candidacy means in the world of LGBTQ. But I also think, as the only LGBTQ candidate in the race, as the only one who's issued a comprehensive LGBTQ policy, I will obviously bring a different lens to the challenges and struggles of this community than other candidates. So I think that's meaningful.
Okay, we have a mic, so if you have a question.
And I feel like I've had my back to this side of the room and ignoring you, so I apologize for that.
Raise your hand so we can make sure you're on camera. Young lady here.
Hi. Is this on?
I like your T-shirt.
Thank you. Can you talk about what specific changes you would make with the Chicago Police Department?
How much time do you have? Yeah, so there's a number of things that have to be done. I was the chair of the Police Accountability Task Force, and we issued a very detailed report with over 100 specific recommendations, frankly, most of which have not been picked up by the current administration. Look, I think one of the most important things that we have to get to is legitimacy and accountability within the police department. That means that we can't keep spending the amount of money that we're spending on settlements and judgments. That means that we actually have to have, for example, an early intervention system that gives supervisors a tool to manage officers who are struggling to fulfill their daily responsibilities and hopefully intervene in a way that puts them back on track, but if not, manage them out of the department. I hope that we are going to build a system of integrity, which means that officers can't continue to lie, either by commission or omission in the discharge of their responsibilities. But ideally, what I'd like to get to is a place where officers recognize, both new recruits and veterans, that having the community on your side is the most important tool that you have, way beyond your badge and your gun. We're not there yet, and again, there's a number of specific things that I think we need to do to get there, but we have to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to have a professional, well-trained, but constitutionally respectful police department. We should be best in class in leading the nation, but we can't get there if we don't have the right leadership, and if we just mouth the words, but we don't have the action. I am the only candidate in this race that's got a background of success and experience on police reform and accountability. And I think that puts me far ahead of the crowd on one of the biggest challenges that the city faces.
Follow up to that, the police consent decree, which grew out of, in many ways, the task force report that you worked on. It's pending, hopefully it's going to be finalized soon. What are your hopes for that, and what will you as mayor do to make sure that it's just a piece of paper, it's just a court order? What will you as mayor do? What is your strategy to make sure that it becomes a reality?
Well, look, I am grateful for the intervention of Lisa Madigan, our now former Attorney General, because it wasn't going to happen without her stepping up. I have been critical of the draft itself because I think it leaves too much on the table and focuses a lot on documenting policies that actually already exist. So I'm concerned about that. It also allows for certain things like chokeholds. That's Eric Garner. It allows for shooting into crowds, which is Betty Jones, and incredibly reckless and dangerous. Doesn't have a policy on foot pursuits, which is something that is so dangerous to officers, the person being pursued, and frankly, surrounding individuals. So there's things that need to be changed in the draft, and I put forward, and it's on our website, a detailed 6-page report. But because I have knowledge and experience about what needs to be done, I will make sure that, frankly, we're doing what the mandate of the federal court is, but we need to go way beyond that. There's nothing in the consent decree about civilian oversight of the police, which I support. There's nothing that tackles this issue of the wasteful amount of money that we're spending on settlements and judgments. I will tackle that. And making sure that we're actually doing the kind of training that is necessary. Basic things like, for example, in New York, before a recruit hits the street, they spend a couple weeks in their neighborhood of assignment during the daylight hours with members of that community, understanding the community, forming relationships that are going to be helpful to them. In Chicago, nothing like that happens, and the recruits, after they graduate from the academy, invariably go on the midnight shift in some of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city. That makes no sense whatsoever, so we got to change that. And obviously, there's a number of changes that have to be made to the existing supervisor and FOP contracts. Again, we articulated a range of things that need to change as part of the task force report. There's a bunch of community organizations that have been working on these proposals. I know how to get the job done because this is the work that I've been engaged in for a number of years now. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So earlier you were remarking on the fact that it's very clear how much development has taken place in Hyde Park while other communities on the south and west side are neglected by developers. And I actually wanted to ask you about something that I heard you speak about in David Orr's class, which I was in earlier last quarter. And you were speaking about the fact that Chicago hasn't had a comprehensive land use plan for decades. And I was actually really struck by that, so much so that I was doing some research on that, and I was surprised that there seems to be very little discussion about like actually creating a comprehensive plan for the city. So I was wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit more about that and kind of what you think about how that could be used to dismantle aldermanic prerogative and kind of create a plan for more equitable development in the city.
So aldermanic prerogative isn't a real thing. It's not written down on paper. It's not part of the municipal code. It doesn't really exist, except it's this powerful thing, right? So the way you dismantle it is to rail against it, as I've done, and then as mayor, issue an executive order that is mandating, particularly the various departments and committees like zoning, planning, and the infrastructure departments, that this is not a thing that we do any longer. And make sure that you have the requisite training and accountability around it. It's got to stop. Where it comes up most is when we talk about two things. One, corruption. So if you had the opportunity to read the affidavit accompanying Ed Burke's charges, that's where automatic privilege is a terrible thing. He used that to try to extort the Burger King operators, and that's happening far too often across the city. If you look at the number of people who've been prosecuted, the aldermen over the years, invariably it comes back to a failed attempt to exercise aldermanic prerogative in ways that are detrimental to the community. We have a affordable housing crisis in the city where we're down well in excess of 120,000 units. 2/3 of the city, not a single affordable housing unit has been built in the last 15 years. Why? Because the city hasn't led and because of automatic prerogative. It's got to go. The point that I made before is we haven't had a comprehensive land use plan since 1966. Now, there are neighborhood quality of life plans, but the city itself hasn't had a plan that sets forth a vision for development all over the city since that time, really early 70s. So the plan was 66, and it was played out into the early 70s. That's terrible. So what does that mean? That means that with the exception of a place like Hyde Park because of the university, there's no investment south of Roosevelt Road or west of Ashland. So the west side and much of the south side is starving. When we leave economic development up to the vagaries of developers, what are they going to do? They're going to go to the more lucrative areas of the city. So we're in contention this week is this huge development of Lincoln Yards, which, by the way, is getting rammed through the regulatory process in ways that is absolutely unconscionable. No effort made to look at the impact on schools, on infrastructure, on transportation, and yet the city's going to throw $1.2 billion. Talk about where the money comes from. There's money on things that we want to prioritize. That doesn't make any sense. So we have to have a comprehensive economic development plan led by the city and not driven by 50 separate fiefdoms that may or may not make sense as we have right now. So that's what we need to do to really change things around pretty significantly.
Next question. In the back? You have the mic?
She's coming.
Okay. Sorry, we need the mic so we make sure we record.
Sure.
Thank you. Could you comment on, just in the way of spurring discourse, on one of your opposing candidates' proposals to decrease the size of city council from 50 to 15, and whether you think there's a conversation to be had there, and if so.
That's Bill Daley's proposal.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Interesting how.
I find his proposals sometimes confusing. He's not putting out kind of comprehensive plans. He's just putting out press releases on a single nugget that ignores everything that you do as part of this kind of larger ecosystem. And to think about things in isolation is to not really move the needle in any meaningful way. So he's trying to get press, which he does, but these plans, in many instances, are frankly just goofy. They don't make sense. They're not really moving the needle in any significant way, and they're not really taking on any of the big challenges. So he puts out a plan and he says, we should reduce the size of city council. It's provocative, gets some news attention, but it's not thoughtful. Look, we have to have a conversation about the size of the aldermen. But I think more, it's got to be in the context of a larger conversation about what do we think the legislative function should be? And how should they be going about conducting their business? How can they be more representative of the people? Does it make sense to cut the size? Will that be more representative? In the context of aldermanic prerogative, if we increase the geography that they have, will they become even more powerful and frankly more difficult for us to move city along? So I'm not opposed to the concept, and certainly we need to have the conversation, but it should be part of a much more comprehensive and frankly thoughtful discussion about what the legislative branch should be.
And what do you think the legislative branch? What is the role of? I mean, we have this, this strong council, weak mayor system supposedly, but it's operated in the opposite
Yeah,
direction for
it
60
only
years.
it only worked when Harold Washington was mayor, right?
Right.
Look, I think that the city council has to stand on its own 2 feet, and no mayor should fear a strong city council. If you think you've got the corner ideas, you're wrong. The city council, if it's working effectively, is closer to the needs of individual families and neighborhoods and communities, and should be, frankly, the testing ground for a lot of innovation. That's not happening now for a host of reasons, not the least of which is they haven't built the infrastructure to be able to do their jobs effectively. You know, they finally got a budgeting office a couple years back. It's one guy whose job is to analyze this very opaque, complicated city budget. That doesn't make any sense. They're not willing to invest in ways in which they could actually make themselves smarter and be a counterweight to the mayor's office, which is why we see the rubber stamping. They're so dependent upon the mayor to tell them what to do, to give them the facts, to give them data. They don't know how to exercise their own power. I don't think that's good for our democracy. I really don't. What about this side of the room? Oh, we got one up here front here.
Given that most college students are only here for about 4 years, why do you think it's important for them to vote in the local elections?
I'm sorry, say the question again.
Given that most college students are only here for the next 4 years, why do you think it's important for them to get out and vote in local elections?
This is a great question. Because you're a resident of our city. What happens here affects you. And frankly, the truth is many college students end up staying for a longer period of time. They don't just disappear. I was told in preparation for this event that working through various student organizations in the university that 80% of the students here were registered to vote. I think that's really powerful. You know, things that matter to you, like why is it that we have college tuitions that are going through the roof and don't seem to be tethered to any rhyme or reason, that student loan debt is a huge burden, that college isn't accessible to lots of different people. What about quality health care? And those are all things that resonate both at a local level and a state level that directly affect young people like yourself. So I think it's really, really important for you to be involved in the political conversation. Plus, if you're involved in active now, the chances are you're going to be involved in active for the rest of your lifetime. People who stay home are voting for the status quo. You're giving your power to somebody else. And our democracy depends on participation. And young people, I think, have a very important role to play. If young people showed up in large numbers to vote in this election on February 26th, you could have outsized power to transform and reshape the narrative. But because people feel like young people don't vote, I don't really have to pay attention to their issues, you're yielding your power. I think it's really important.
On the automatic level as well,
Absolutely.
The power could even be greater because of the numbers. You've got
Yeah, I mean,
several thousand students here that could easily sway a ward election.
Yeah, you were going to see in automatic elections, and some of them, there with few exceptions of last cycle, there was one or two wards where the total vote was in the 20,000s, but most of the automatic total vote is in the 5,000 range. Imagine the power that you'd have if you showed up and you voted in big numbers in automatic races.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on your plan to increase access to affordable housing in the city?
Yes. We put out a affordable housing policy that has about 10 different points to it. Let me tell you the context in which that policy was formed, and I'll tell you the specific thoughts that we have. In thinking about this race, right, you think about what are the issues that I want to really talk about that are important. And I will say that affordable housing wasn't on the top of my radar. But everywhere I went, everywhere, and you're continuing the streak, this issue comes up. It is one of the most important issues that we have to tackle. Depending on where we go, and I think I said this before, we're down, depending on who you talk to, we're down about 120,000 affordable housing units. And if you look at our policy, we put together what I'll call a heat map that shows where affordable housing construction has happened, but mostly where it hasn't happened in the city. So what do we have to do? One, we have to make sure that the newly constituted Department of Housing actually is an advocate for building affordable housing units. What I mean by that is, what we hear from, particularly from community-based housing developers, is it's so difficult to do business with the city. The city doesn't come in until late, and when they come in, they throw up all these roadblocks instead of trying to partner with us to get to yes. So we've got to eliminate those difficulties, and that means making sure that the Department of Housing is coordinating efforts, gets involved in deals early, sets out what the rules of engagement are, and then works to get to yes if that's at all possible. I talked about automatic prerogative. It's a huge problem, particularly in the space of affordable housing. The other thing that we have to do is this thing called the affordable ARO, forgetting the name of it, but it's an ordinance that basically mandates that developers have to have a certain percentage of units as affordable, but they can work around that in two ways. One is they can build units someplace else to meet their requirement, or they can pay what's called in lieu of fees. So they just give the city some cash instead of building affordable housing units. That's a problem. So what we propose is expanding the mandate on the percentage of affordable housing units that have to be built in the properties themselves. And if they're going to build comparable units elsewhere, it's got to be closer in location to the affordable housing development. And frankly, what I'd like to see us do is get rid of the in lieu of fees. So that's another thing that we can do. The other thing that we propose, and when you talk about affordable housing, you have to talk about homelessness and the number of people that are suffering from what we politely call housing instability, meaning they're homeless. They may not be out on the streets and under an underpass, but they're couch surfing. They're living with relatives. They don't have a stable source of housing. So we propose a progressive tax on real estate transfers that we believe will yield somewhere between 60 and 80 million on an annual basis that we can then use to address the homelessness problem. Now, that's a comprehensive problem. It's very nuanced. There are a lot of people that are on the street because of addiction, which we're doing not nearly enough. There are people on the street, particularly in the LGBTQ community. The vast majority of young people that are on the street are people that have come out and been kicked out of their houses from their families, and particularly young people of color who are LGBTQ. It's a big, huge issue. We've got to build wraparound services and 24-hour shelters for them. I spent some time at a shelter for homeless youth, and particularly focused on LGBTQ folks. Vast majority of the kids that came through that night were kids of color. A lot of this was on the north side. A lot of them were on the south side. They had trouble actually getting access to the services because they didn't have money to get on the CTA. This is a big, huge issue that we're doing virtually nothing about. You know, I'm driving here to Hyde Park from downtown where our offices are. There's this huge homelessness encampment now in the area of Roosevelt Road, right on the expressway, and there's another one to the east of the expressway. What we are not doing in addressing the homelessness problem in the city is truly a sin. I mean, it's absolutely unacceptable that we are allowing so many people on the street and we're not reaching out to them to provide services. We're not providing nearly the support that we could with community organizations like the Night Ministry, for example, that are really trying to make a difference in our homeless population. So those are some of the things that I think we should be doing right away and can easily do to get at this affordable housing crisis. And one last thing that I'll say, our building code is totally antiquated. We know from the examples of other cities that, for example, the tiny house movement, using different kinds of materials in housing. There's a movement on the south side in particular to retrofit shipping containers and build housing that way. We've got to be creative about the ways in which we're addressing the affordable housing crisis. The building code doesn't allow for building out garden apartments in the way that it could. We've got a lot of garden and basement apartments that could be built out into good quality housing, but our building code doesn't allow for it. We've got to change that.
We have time for one more.
You mentioned earlier that the UCPD predominantly stops Black
students and also Black community members.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
You mentioned earlier that the UCPD predominantly stops Black students and Black community members. How do private entities, particularly the UCPD, fit into your police accountability plan?
And I apologize, the last part again?
How do private entities, and particularly the UCPD, fit into your police accountability plan?
Well, look, one of the most important things I think we have to do is be much more transparent about stops. Laura will remember this. When I was in the process of getting reappointed as president of the police board, the mayor's people put out a bogus story and said, well, one of the questions we had about is she hadn't put out an annual report for the police board. Well, we actually had. They never read it. But the ironic part about that is CPD hasn't put out an annual report in years, in part because the mayor's office won't let them put the data out. You go to their website, it's like this Byzantine process. If you look at other cities, for example, like New Orleans and others, you can get real-time crime data, statistics on the website because they know that one of the methods they have to do to build legitimacy is provide people with data and information about what's actually happening. We don't have that here, and that's got to change. I think the other thing that we have to do is make sure that we continue the training. The training really is important. You know, Gary McCarthy is a candidate for mayor. If you look at what happened in 13 and 14, and 14 in particular during the summer of 14 in this city, he brought aggressive stop and frisk to the city of Chicago. Our numbers on a per capita basis were worse than New York at the height of stop and frisk there. The only reason it stopped is because the ACLU got the data, crunched the numbers, brought it to the city and said, if this doesn't stop, we're going to sue you. We shouldn't have to get to that point. We've got to be much more strategic, both about the way that we plan and the way that we engage communities, particularly communities of color. Black people in particular, but also Latinx community, feel like the quality of policing that they get is dictated by their race. When we were doing community forums as part of the Police Accountability Task Force work, we had a community forum over here on the east side at the South Shore Country Club. And I will never forget, there was an older woman, she was probably in her late 60s, early 70s. She was a professional, I think maybe a doctor. And she talked about the fact that she felt like she was under siege in her neighborhood. And she lived in a very nice middle-class neighborhood. But she recounted the number of times that she had been stopped by the police. And frankly, any of you have been stopped by the police? I have. It's scary. And I got a lot of experience. I'm a former prosecutor, work for the police department. It still raises your anxiety level. And if you don't even have that background experience, it's very anxiety causing. And what I learned from her, and from frankly countless stories of other people, is that police officers don't think about the effect that stopping someone, asking them for their information, not providing them with a rationale for why they stopped them, and providing basic courtesy makes a difference. I've heard, frankly, just this weekend, I was talking to somebody at the barbershop about their experience with a police officer who called them everything but a child of God, and that sticks with them. Now, unless a citizen has a countervailing positive experience with the police, they're always going to think the police are illegitimate. Police can't function without legitimacy, and you can't have legitimacy without, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, just to clarify, I think you specifically wanted to hear about the University of Chicago Police Department and how.
I'm sorry.
How you would
I
interact.
misunderstood the question. Look, I know the police chief here very well. I think he has tried to bring a level of legitimacy and accountability and training to the police department here that frankly was far different than my experience here 30 years ago. You did not want to be stopped by university police back in the day under any circumstances. But look, you can't ever rest. Just as what I was talking about with CPD, university police have to do exactly the same thing. They have to build relationships with the student population, with the larger Hyde Park community, because they have a big jurisdiction here. And they've got to be very transparent when something goes down. I mean, I remember the situation last year with a student who was shot by the university police. Now that was somewhat unusual circumstances, but those are the times when if you don't have a well of goodwill built up with people in your community, people are going to have all sorts of questions. So the daily work of building those relationships, and when you make a mistake, admitting it. My old boss, Taylor Hillard, used to say, if you mess up, you got to fess up and clean up. That means when you make a mistake, say it. Talk about what you're going to do better the next time, and own it. I think people will respect that. Even if it's a bad mistake, you got to own it and not hide behind it and do, frankly, what we saw play out in the Lujan McDonald case, build a false narrative that, frankly, undermines credibility even more. So I hope that's actually more responsive to your question.
I think we're out of time. Thank you very much, Lori. This has been a wonderful conversation.
My pleasure.
I have one final question, and that is, since you're going to be in the runoff, there will be a runoff, and
Yes.
since you're going to be in the runoff,
I will.
right?
Yes.
We would like to invite you back
Sure.
to campus. IOP is planning a forum just around police accountability, police reform, public safety on March 13th.
Okay, I'd love
So
to be
if you
here.
put that at midday, so if you put that on your calendar,
Definitely will.
and we will see you then.
Okay, great. And shameless plug, if you're interested in getting involved in the campaign, Shell and others are here with clipboards. We have internships that hopefully will interest you. But I always appreciate being back on campus. People here, and this audience has proved me right, are smart and thoughtful. And I hope you do get engaged, because being engaged and voting is critically important. If you don't, we cede the ground to the status quo, which frankly has failed us way too often. So thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed the opportunity.